Hi and welcome. So we're diving into Revelation again, and I've called this 1,000 years to be or not to be. That is the question. Really, because I want to look at the millennium. I was going to look at chapters 21 and, just the end of the book, basically. I thought we'd got to that point. And then I realized actually chapter 20, it's all about the millennium. Excuse me, just getting this straight. Chapter 20 is all about the millennium, and that must be one of the most controversial things of all, and it was very tempting to jump over it. Hopefully I haven't offended anybody too much so far, but who knows, I might do today, but I hope not, because as I say, all these views are out there, and who's to say which is the right one. But what I want to do is to cover a lot of ground, to sort of fly over the land, to get a picture of what it's like before, if you want to dive any deeper into any of these topics, then you can do on your own. But I've given you an overview, and that's what I want to do. And what I want to do is break down this idea that there is one view, because we hear of one view, and I heard of one view as I was learning this stuff years ago, and I realized there is so much more, and I want to expand your brain power a little bit and get you to think a bit more rather than just take what you see and what you're given. You can see, you watch some things, God TV, some of the other ones, it very much, you have stories on Revelation based on one view, but the other views are have been in the past just as popular and still are in some circles. So stay with me on all this. I think there is a problem with Revelation. We can get stuck into it so much and get so taken up with it, as people do, that it's all they look at, and we don't get out and share the love and good news of Jesus, which is what we are meant to be doing. But also I do realize that if we get our view of Revelation twisted in some way, we can also have, it could be the same problem, that we don't end up sharing the love and good news of Jesus. So, because we're caught up with fear, and I want to break that down as well. So hence this study. Before we move on, I did talk about the number 666 last time, the so-called mark of the beast or whatever, which if you looked at the last one, it's not that straightforward. And we talked about how numbers are words and so on, and that can be, in Hebrew, can be used for letters. And I came across this story I thought was quite amusing. It was sent by a literary scholar called Catherine Linskog. She sent it to friends of hers on the internet, and what she said she did was this, like you would do with a maths question. She said, okay, the given is that Barney is a cute purple dinosaur, and you have to prove that Barney is really the Antichrist in disguise. So you start with the given, cute purple dinosaur. Then you change all the U's in that phrase, cute purple dinosaur, into V's, because, that's a proper Latin anyway. You extract all the Roman numerals from the phrase. So you've got the Roman numerals, and you end up with C, V, V, L, D, 1, V. You then convert those Roman numerals into Arabic values, into numbers. And what you end up with for each of those Roman numerals is 100, 5, 50, 500, 1, and 5. Add the numbers together, what do you get? 666. There you go. You see how easy it is to come up with a conspiracy theory. But I think it does prove the point. We need to do our exegesis properly to find out what did it mean to John's readers. They would have understood. He wasn't trying to put something that would only be worked out in 2,000 years, and somebody who can write a book and come up with, I know what it means. He was making it clear to them. Anyway, let's move on. So I just want to recap. When we're looking at the millennium, we really need to just recap on two of the main views, because some of the other ones would have different views of the millennium and so on. But these main ones are the ones that would have probably different views about what this millennial reign is all about. So the two main views we want to look at, just to remind you, is the predictive or the futurist view. Dispensationalism comes into that. That's the one that tends to be most common. And I've said before that it focuses on two main types. There is the historical predictive approach, which really looks at history, and mainly church history, from the time of the resurrection right up to the present time, and looking at how Revelation supposedly predicted what was going to happen in the different ages coming up to the present time, and looking for what had happened. That's the historical approach. The one that's very popular, which is basically dispensationalism, was made popular by J.N. Darby, was put in the Schofield Bible, and so on, and that looks at splitting up the world into different ages, and it talks about everything being very linear, so from the resurrection and up to the present day and onwards to the Jesus coming back. We're looking at there being this time of tribulation, there being the rapture. Some believe it will come before the tribulation, some in the middle of, and so on. The Jesus coming back, setting up his 1,000-year reign on the earth, that's the millennium, and then the final battle, and so on. Yeah, a lot of you will have heard that, and I don't need to go into that any great depth. The other main view is the preterist view, and preterist means past, and is sometimes called then the contemporary historical. And it views Revelation really as a message for its own time. And so a lot of what you see in Revelation was actually for their own time. And the tribulation you see in there, a lot of preterists would say that is what happened in AD 70, when God judged the Jewish nation for rejecting Jesus, and Jerusalem was destroyed as Jesus predicted it would be. And it was a pretty horrendous time as well. Okay, so there's the two main views, and we will look at those in line with the millennium and see what we come up with. So keeping those two in mind. So Revelation 20, that tells us that Christians are raised from the dead in the first resurrection, and those Christians rule and reign with Jesus for 2,000 years. For 1,000 years, sorry, I put 2,000 here. For 1,000 years. This is called the millennial reign of Jesus. What do we make of this 1,000-year reign? Well, there are two main views. You see, there's all main views, but we can go off down different side streams. But I want to focus on the main ones because it's easy to get confused anyway, as it is. And then we can go on from there if you want. But two main views, the post-millennial and the pre-millennial. Okay, post-millennial or pre-millennial. Sounds quite straightforward, doesn't it? Post-millennial then sees Revelation 20 as a recapitulation of the previous pretty much 19 chapters, at least from about chapter 3 or whatever through. And what they would say is that the millennial reign of Jesus started 2,000 years ago when Jesus ascended into heaven and sat at the right hand of God and sat on his throne. So therefore, we're actually living in the millennial reign now. Jesus is reigning now, and we're in that place. And he will return to the earth at the end of this millennial reign. Hence, post-millennialism, because Jesus will return post the millennium, at the end of the millennium. Okay? But you ask, it's been more than 1,000 years since Jesus rose again, and he's not come back. How can it be 1,000-year millennial reign? That can't be right. I'm glad you asked the question, because post-millennialists would say it's not a literal 1,000 years. The way that Hebrews use numbers and so on is fascinating, because as we've already seen with the purple dinosaur, they have a different way of using numbers. They will take numbers and they can turn them into letters and all sorts of things. But not only that, numbers don't have to be literal. We are so literal in the West, but their view wasn't so literal. So I'll give you an example to prove that the number 1000 can be an indefinite number. It doesn't have to be literally 1000. What about the fact the Bible says that he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills? Psalm 50 verse 10. Do we literally think that God owns just the cattle on 1,000 hills? And if you counted the hills and you got to 1001, well, those aren't God's. Those belong to someone else. No, it's just a saying, isn't it? Psalm 84 verse 10 says that one day in God's house is better than 1,000 elsewhere. Well, we don't take that literally, do we? Not literally. It's just a use of numbers in a very loose way. And many influential church leaders in the past have taken this view of the 1,000-year reign as not being a literal 1,000. People like John Calvin, John Knox, Augustine, Eusebius, going back further, had this same view. Okay, so we can bear that in mind when we read this sort of thing. Let me just read chapter 20, verses 1 to 3. And I'll try and make this a little bit clearer for you as well, so you can see how we have to be careful with Revelation. And you can accept this or not, it doesn't matter. I just want to give you this. This is what people would say, and it's an important point. So chapter 20, verses 1 to 3. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, having the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. He laid hold of the dragon, that serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he cast him into the bottomless pit and shut him up and set a seal on him. And that he should deceive the nations no more until the 1,000 years were finished. But after these things, he must be released for a little while. Okay, let me ask you a question. What about the dragon in those 3 verses? Is that a literal dragon or is it a figurative dragon? Do you expect there to be a real dragon, as it says there? What about the chains? Are they literal chains or are they figurative chains? What about the bottomless pit? Is it a literal bottomless pit or is it being figurative? And then the final question, what about the 1,000 years? Is it literal or figurative? You see, we can see a lot of things in Revelation and say, oh, well, that's obviously figurative. I'm not going to see a literal dragon and so on. And there are lots of figurative things in Scripture and in Revelation particularly. And it's the way that this sort of writing is done. So we have to ask ourselves, the millennium could also be figurative. Just put it out there and think about it. Okay, pre-millennial. So if you're a pre-millennialist, then this view sees chapter 20 as following on in order from the chapters before, the previous 19 chapters, okay? So it's a very linear view. Dispensations, different eras, moving on through, okay? So it follows on chronologically. And the view is that Jesus will return to earth before his millennial reign, and the reign will take place on earth. So he will return to earth, set up his throne, and there'll be judgment there. Here we need to muddy the waters a little bit, so bear with, as they say, because there are 2 different pre-millennial views. There are dispensational premillennialists and there are historical premillennialists. Lovely, isn't it? So dispensational believers, premillennialists, they believe that they would be obviously the futurists, the predictive believers, you know, the ones that dispensationalism and so on, all that we've talked about. And they see the events of chapters 4 through to chapter 18 happening during a 7-year period of tribulation before the second coming of Jesus, which the world goes through. They see wars, famines, earthquakes, antichrist, destruction, and so on before Jesus returns. It's a horrendous picture of what's going to happen. And it's called dispensationalism because it was developed out of dispensational theology, which divides history into different time periods, okay, which I spoke about before. So that's that type of premillennialism belief is dispensational. You've also got a historical dispensational belief. A historical premillennialism. You see, as you try and get into these things, it gets so complicated. That sees Jesus returning before his millennial reign, but so he will have his millennium on earth, but it doesn't necessarily include all the catastrophic events and the tribulation, because that could well have happened back in AD 70. But there's still the belief that even though that will happen back in AD 70, that tribulation, Jesus will come back and set up his 1,000-year reign on earth. So still a premillennialist. And those who hold a preterist view, therefore, can hold either of those two different views of the millennium. So it makes, that's all possible. And that whole thing, when Jerusalem was overrun in AD 70 by the Emperor Titus, the Roman general Titus rather, it was horrific. They were under siege in Jerusalem. There was internal factions in Jerusalem fighting against each other, so it was gruesome. People attacked each other. There was, eating their children, all sorts of horrendous things. And then the army came in and it was a bloodbath. It was horrendous the whole time. It was horrendous to read. They slayed loads of people when the army came in. So it was a real time of tribulation. Horrendous. We don't want to go there, but it wasn't nice. So you can see the point. So having muddied things up, hopefully you're still with me. And as I say, this chapter has caused a lot of debate in the body of Christ, a lot of division, and I just say, let's stop all that, and let's just say we don't know all the answers, but we can sort of go with what we feel fits the facts the most. So if we're waiting for the millennium, here's the question to come, Jesus to come and rule and reign on earth. Does that mean we are waiting for the kingdom? Because some would say, well, the kingdom doesn't start until Jesus comes and sets up his reign, his 1,000 reign on the earth. And many hold the view that a linear event of the events in chapters 19 and 20 makes sense, you see, and many of the early church fathers, such as Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and others believed it in this linear view. They were called Chiliists, if you want to. It was the view. And the argument they would make is that after Constantine, the Roman emperor, became a Christian, and the state supported Christianity for the first time, probably in a really strong way. And some would say it was a great thing. Some would say it's a problem. But after Constantine became a Christian and the state supported Christianity, they would say there was no longer any need for Jesus to come to earth and destroy the state and destroy what was going on, Rome, Babylon, and all the rest of it, the hated Babylon. It wasn't there anymore. The state was friendly. So we didn't need that. And they would say that that was the only reason that premillennialism became popular. And, they didn't need the empire overthrown. However, one problem with this sort of linear reading can be that we end up seeing ourselves as a weak church. We're waiting to go through this horrendous time of tribulation. We're watching the news, shaking in our boots and wondering, looking to see things get darker as the world gets worse and worse. And we're waiting for Jesus to come back. And our only hope is really that Jesus will come back and establish his kingdom. That can be the fear. And I was brought up with that sort of understanding that we were just waiting for that. I know somebody who gave their lives to Jesus because they were waiting for Jesus to come back and the tribulation, all the rest of it. And he was there at home, and a lorry went past outside and changed gear very, very loudly. And his dad had been talking to him about these things, and he thought it was Jesus coming back. So he gave his life to Jesus there and then. So it couldn't be a bad thing in one way, but do you really want to come into the kingdom through fear or through love? That's the thing. So we have to be careful if we hold that view. That's all I'm saying. And, perhaps we can end up with the fear, things like, Bill Gates is the Antichrist and putting microchips in the vaccine and all the rest of it. And, we can end up in these horrendous conspiracy theories that lead us into wrong waters. Now, if we're in the millennium reign now and Jesus sat down at the right hand of God and the kingdom is increasing in the earth, and people say it's growing like a grain of mustard seed as the church extends his rule. And people would say that the great stone, the rock that was carved out not by human hands in Daniel's interpretation of King Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel chapter 2, you can see that was in fact Jesus, as many would agree, but that it shows how the kingdom is going to grow and fill the whole earth before Jesus returns, spreading his influence far and wide. So whatever you believe, it helps to have some idea of where other people are coming from, so that when you listen to preachers, when you focus in on something, whether it's on YouTube, on God TV, wherever it is, when you open up that book that you've bought and so on, you get an understanding of where these people are coming from and what their view of end times is, because it does tend to affect how you approach life today. And, it's important to have an understanding of these things, I think. And again, it isn't about there being only one view that is right. There has been thousands of words written by very knowledgeable Bible scholars who love Jesus at least as much as you and I do, if not more. And these people have studied the original Greek, Hebrew, whatever they have, the Aramaic, they have looked at it, they've pulled it apart, they've debated it, they know their stuff, and they have come up with different interpretations. So let's be open. And if I have not given your view a clear interpretation, I can only apologize. It's an impossible task to cover all these in detail, but I assure you, when you go into them, all of them have a ring of truth. All of them have a possibility, so we have to be so careful. Okay, next time, going up or coming down. God's kingdom eventually comes fully. God bless you.